Cosmic Race is a very early futuristic racing game that was released for the PlayStation in Japan only back in early 1995. This would also have been one of the very first ever racing games seen on the system during that time. And while the PlayStation during its early months were starting to showcase some very unique and high quality games that would go on to span multiple sequels and become super successful, what many don't know is that there were quite a number of games that were released on the system that were the total opposite of that, and Cosmic Race is considered to be one of them. This game is also known by many to be one of the worst video games ever created, and even just so on the PlayStation itself, even to a point that it's also known as one of the worst video games of all time among critics and magazine reviews, mainly down to very poor graphics and poor and in many cases non-existent collision detection in the game itself. In many cases the game just felt very substandard across every level and throughout all areas of the game, which led to the very poor reviews. In many cases magazine reviews just went to town on it and pretty much just in so many words just said that there was literally no work or no effort put into creating the game, which is a pity when you think about it. Like, the game does have some characteristics that could potentially have made it appealing back in the day, but it just was not executed correctly. Now, I'd never heard of this game up until recent times, as I was trying to look through the back catalogue of futuristic style racing games, as I've been trying to create content for making videos on the channel. And I had kind of seen this one on and off, and I says I would give it a try. And considering it's a very early title, I was intrigued to see what it was like, but after having played it, I can agree with the reviews that have been found online. The game is quite clunky, the control system is pretty much non-existent, if I'll be honest. It's hard to really know or understand what to do, and a lot of times it's so clunky and bad that it doesn't often work too well. Now, it definitely, I had to struggle to sit down to play with it for long enough to really understand the game, and I did manage to get through it to some degree, but it's hard to know, even though you're on a track, but you can literally go off the track or go under the track or go through the terrain at any time. Like, the collision detection, like I said, to a certain point is non-existent. There is certain points when you go too low or you go too high, when you pretty much go like off the camera, it will hit a point where you can't move any further, or in most cases the track layouts and design is very poorly executed, that while you're floating along on your hovercraft you will literally hit like almost like a wall where you have to rise up and rise down, where you have to raise the vehicle up higher to a higher like altitude or lower to the ground depending on where you are at the given time. But it's not apparent to do that, and then coupled with that, with the very dodgy camera, you have to pretty much hold the acceleration button, but you also have to hold the direction buttons to kind of keep the camera in check, because if not the camera completely goes off on a tangent and actually stops you from seeing or even knowing where your ship is at any given time, which can completely throw you off. It feels like a very early alpha build of a game that wasn't fully finished, but it was just kind of just put out there just to get it out. It just feels like there was so much left on the table that could have been perfected or tweaked or just finished in general, but wasn't. Because the graphics themselves, like, yes, it is a very early PlayStation game, like we can't expect the graphics to be phenomenal, and even at the time that was one of the issues in the magazine, saying that the graphics were quite poor, but we were still at an early stage of 3D games, so games themselves were only starting to come into their own at that point. So the graphics you can get away with to some degree, but the playability with the camera physics, the control physics, and even the collision detection, if that's not up to scratch, then pretty much everything else is irrelevant anyway, regardless of how good or how bad the game looks. If the gameplay itself is poor, it's not going to be worth your time. And unfortunately, I can't begin to imagine the amount of people that would have spent money on this game, even if they did want to try it, because whatever price it was back in that day, it definitely wasn't worth the full price tag. If you could get it cheap and even add it to a collection, like if you're a retro game collector, you would just add it to your collection as just for the sake of saying yeah, just to have it. And you could try it, but it wouldn't be for everybody, even for myself. And I don't like talking poorly of games. I genuinely always try to give the game the benefit of the doubt. Now, in saying that, when I did sit down to test it out, I didn't know what to do at first. The controls, it's not apparent. I know, yes, it's in the Japanese language, but it's not apparent to figure out how to accelerate and how to move up and down. I had to keep messing and tweaking and testing different things to figure out what to do. And then I did manage to figure out how to control the ship, and I was able to keep it somewhat on the track, but the problem is the camera is tied into the controls. So the camera completely goes off on a tangent. So if you're not watching what you're doing and trying to keep the camera in check, the camera will just will randomly just go off on its own and completely leave you oblivious to where your ship is. So you will crash into things and you'll just completely lose track of where you are in the race. And in saying that, the races themselves aren't fully fleshed out, because the races, like, to do one race, it can take an absolute eternity to finish a race. Like, at one point I was doing like a stretch, it's like almost like a sprint race, and I was on the track for nearly like 10 minutes, like just literally just trying to get from point A to point B. Like, the loading times themselves are long, but then the races themselves are even longer. But then when you have to deal with all of those gripes and the poor gameplay mechanics, you can understand why people don't want to play the game. But I suppose it's just a piece of gaming history, probably not for the best of reasons, but it is what it is. It's something that had potential to be a lot more, but just wasn't executed as well as it could have been, which is a pity. At least when we look at future racing games that we're seeing on the system, when you look at the likes of Wipeout and other iconic futuristic games, they definitely got it right first time. They didn't leave any issues out, and if anything, the sequels to those games improved on all of the aspects with each iteration of the game. But unfortunately with Cosmic Race, that was never going to really be a thing, unfortunately. And it is reflective in its reviews, like I said. It is what it is. It's a piece of gaming history, but for all the wrong reasons, unfortunately. And it's a pity to see that games like this were being released at that time on consoles that weren't fully finished or fully completed, that just pretty much what you see is what you get, and that's it all as such. But regardless, I would love to hear your thoughts of this if you have played it yourself, and if so, what do you think of it? Did you get anything from the game at all, or did you just literally turn it off as soon as you turned the game on, like most other people probably did back in the day? So I'd love to hear your opinions and thoughts on this game, so be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of games that I am going to be exploring on the PlayStation that are very quirky, obscure, and that are relatively unheard of for the most part, or also released on the PS1, then you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.